So thank you, everyone. Welcome to our Clinical Outcome Assessment webinar series. This is Eleanor Perfetto from the National Health Council, and we thank you for joining us on a Friday afternoon. We have an exciting webinar today with two great speakers. We're going to be talking about 21st Century Cures, the requirement that it has in it on patient experience data and related information. And our two guest speakers are going to be Annie Kennedy and Meghana Chalasani from the FDA, and Annie from the EveryLife Foundation. Silke, would you move to the next slide, please? And so as is typical, I'm going to review some background slides that we go through for our webinar, and then I'm going to introduce the two speakers who will then step in to give us their presentations. Next slide, Silke. So the objective for our webinar today is to introduce to the patient audience the origin of the patient experience data provision of the 21st Century Cures Act and describe how it's being implemented by the FDA. Next slide, please. Just as a reminder, clinical outcome assessment, the definition of that is these are measures of a patient's symptoms, overall mental state, or the effect of a disease or condition on how the patient functions. They tell you about how a patient feels and functions in their everyday life. There are different types of patient-reported outcome measures, different types of clinical outcome assessments. There are patient-reported outcome measures, clinician-reported measures, observer-reported outcome measures, and performance measures. Next slide. Just a reminder to you, we are very excited about patient-centered outcome measures. And we know that there's a lot of work being done in patient-reported outcomes. And we just want to be sure that you understand that there can very often be a difference between these. And so what we really think is the ideal situation is when a patient-reported outcome measure gets to those things that are really important to patients. That means they have to be both patient-reported and patient-centered. And that's the ideal situation. Next slide, please. So it's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers today. Annie Kennedy is the Chief of Policy and Advocacy at the EveryLife Foundation for Rare Diseases. I believe, Annie, it's only been a few days that you've actually had that title, and most of the folks who are on the call are probably very familiar with Annie's work. For nearly 3 decades, she's been working for the patient community with her roles at Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy most recently, and of course her work with the Muscular Dystrophy Association. Meghana is currently the Senior Research Analyst in for the Patient-Focused Drug Development Program in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the FDA. Meghana holds a master's degree in health policy and management from Columbia University, and she has a bachelor's degree in medicine, health, and society from Vanderbilt. So I'm going to turn this over now to Annie, who's going to start us off, and she's going to tell more of the history about how this work got initiated and the involvement of the patient community in getting this off the ground. So Annie, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, super. Thanks, Eleanor. If we could have the next slide, and the next slide. Super. All right, thanks. I think to set some context, we're just going to take a little trip back in time to 2012 and FDASIA, which everyone will remember. I think probably everyone on this call is heavily steeped in. And so as we were all involved in FDASIA and the related user fee agreements, you will recall that they included numerous provisions that were intended to strengthen our stakeholder engagement within the medical product review process. And many organizations like PPMD, ours, and many other patient groups were really engaged in those discussions, many of us through the National Health Council and other organizations that were really helping us to ensure that the user fee agreement would include a formalization of the way that patient communities would engage in medical product development. And that's really where patient-focused drug development evolved from a concept to really formalized processes. And we can go to the next slide. So many of us became really innovators within these processes, and we're developing many tools for implementation within medical product development. And among those tools included patient preference studies, guidance for industry. At PPMD, we were one of the first groups to develop a patient committee-led guidance, PROs, registry data, testimony from patient and clinical experts. There were the voice of the patient meetings and externally led PFDD meetings that were being held. And there was a lot of data, evidence-based data that was now being created and developed. And what we really needed to understand was that despite this momentum, questions that were coming up was how was any of this going to fit into the regulatory framework? And I'll give you an example. At PPMD, one of the patient preference studies that we conducted was a study that we did with Synthera Pharmaceuticals, and it was designed to evaluate the benefit-risk trade-off that patients, a subset of patients within our community, were willing to experience for specific potential benefits specific to their therapy that they were developing. And as we were working with Synthera, one of the questions came up from the company was how would this be able to be utilized within the context of the package that they would submit to the FDA. And there were no real clear answers on that. We didn't really know how this would fit in, how the work that we were doing, as we were actually engaging with the FDA on the attributes that we would be collecting within the preference study. There was a lot of high-level engagement with the agency. But at the end of the day, how would this data and information make it to reviewers and be a part of the context for the review? And we didn't actually know. And we also didn't know whether or not we would ever know that. Would there ever be a feedback loop as to whether or not this information would be fed back to us? And so that is really where we, and then the other thing I'll stir in here is we then began to have products that did start to go through regulatory review and had a number of experiences through that, where again, all of these resources and data were being generated within our context within Duchenne, but we were seeing it happen for other communities. And as products were not being approved, again, we had no way of knowing whether or not these resources, these tools were being incorporated into the considerations that were being made by reviewers. So next slide. So we began to work with our congressional leadership and talk to them about these concerns and these issues. And what shook out was the Patient-Focused Impact Assessment Act. I'm missing a word there, but PFIA. And so what we really wanted to do was be able to understand and bring transparency to the FDA review process to understand how reviewers were or were not using the PFDD tools that were being developed. In short, we just wanted a feedback loop, and we thought this was just the evolution of the science of patient impact, this science of patient input. And we also wanted there to be a report across the divisions to understand how this data was being used, because we were hearing that there might be inconsistencies. And so that was another piece of this legislation. So simply stated, we wanted to ensure that the tools being created under PFDD would make the regulatory impact that they were intended to. So this legislation was passed into law and became, if you go to the next slide, it might be on the next slide, but became the basis for Section 3001 of 21st Century Cures, or the Patient Experience Data section that was incorporated into the FDA review. And so this is what it looks like, and I'm sure everyone on this call has seen it. We did not, and so I think for the sake of the rest of this conversation, the legislation is very short. If you go and pull the bill, you'll see it's a very short piece of legislation. It was intended to not be overly prescriptive. This was not, we did not actually even, we gave some samples of things that we thought should be a part of this checklist, if you will, but we did not want to overly prescribe what was included. We wanted that to be left at the discretion of the agency. So this list was developed by the agency, and I'm sure Meghana will talk about that in a second. But essentially, we just wanted there to be some understanding on our parts of what was beneficial, what was useful, and what was actually being utilized, so that as patient organizations, academics, industry were developing these tools and providing them with the intention of them being a resource, we were understanding whether or not they were actually making an impact and how we could do better going forward. All right, next slide. So we worked with our legislative consultants to do just a little bit of tracking to better understand how the patient experience data was actually being utilized, and this is just sort of a slide to show you within the reviews where patient experience data was being incorporated into NDAs and BLAs. This goes through February of 2019. We recognize that this was very early stage, and I will say FDA implemented this very swiftly and very quickly after 21st Century Cures was signed into law, and we were thrilled about that. We've been very pleased with the fact that it has been adapted so quickly. I think there's a lot of room for improvement. I'm sure we'll talk about that on the phone. And it's something that we've heard from industry partners around, how can even industry be helping to guide reviewers to where in the submission the reviewers can find the patient experience data. So there are a lot of conversations about how to make this more user-friendly, since there's obviously a lot of information to go through. But we've been very grateful for the fact that it was implemented so quickly and that there has clearly been a desire on the part of reviewers to look for this information when it's been made available. One of the suggestions that came up, actually Eleanor and I participated in a meeting that was convened by BIO just recently, was that perhaps even industry could complete the checklist in advance as a part of the submission for reviewers, so reviewers would know where to look for patient experience data within the submission package. And then reviewers could then fill out the checklist to say whether or not that information, patient experience data, was actually useful or informative and actually utilized within the review or not. But instead of making the reviewers have to go search for it, to actually lead them to where they might actually find the data. I think I'll stop there and just hand it off. This, I think, is my last slide. Yep. All right. Hand off.
Meghana? We'll turn it over to you, Meghana.
Thanks, Eleanor. Thanks, Annie. Annie, I think your presentation very nicely set it up for what I'm about to go through. If I could have the next slide, please. Just my disclosure that everything that I say today are my own and not that of the agencies. Next slide, please. And you can go ahead and click next one more time. I think there's an animation here. But really just, as Annie mentioned, just really reminding folks that it's really been an evolution, this patient-focused drug development initiative, and everything that we're doing now under PDUFA 6 and 21st Century Cures has really been, a culmination of listening to a community and engaging with stakeholders and really identifying what we needed to do next to really further enhance the incorporation of patient input in medical product development broadly. And so if you could go to the next slide, please. You'll see here that we have a range of efforts within the agency and specifically within the Center for Drugs as well to really further enhance the incorporation of patient input. On the left, you'll see we're doing, in addition to the statement of patient experience, which I'll go into a little bit more detail, we also worked on a glossary to standardize nomenclature. We have a guidance series, a series of associated public workshops, and intention to revise internal documents and processes as needed based on these guidances and a repository as well. In addition to the requirements, we're also continuing to do a lot of the PFDD meetings, externally led as well as internal. We've recently put forth a new grant program, a pilot effort, and we have an external resources website and so forth and so on. But really just wanted to emphasize the range of efforts that we're doing here within the agency to really engage with stakeholders to really continue this patient-focused drug development work that we've started back in 2012. To go a little bit more into the statement of patient experience, I'd first like to talk about what is patient experience data. So if I could have the next slide, please. Patient experience data, as defined in 21st Century Cures, is data that can be collected by any person, and you'll see that there's a list here, that are intended to provide information about patients' experiences with a disease or condition, including the impact of such disease or condition or related therapy on patients' lives, and patient preferences with respect to treatment of such disease or condition. As I mentioned, the agency put together a glossary of standardized terminology, and one of the things that we did do was kind of interpret this definition a little bit further. And so in our PFDD glossary, what we've interpreted patient experience data to be is information that really captures patients' experiences, perspectives, needs, and priorities related to, but not limited to, of course, the symptom of their condition and its natural history, the impact of the conditions on their functioning and quality of life, their experience with treatments, input on which outcomes are important to them, patient preferences for outcomes and treatments, as well as the relative importance of any issue as defined by patients. So I thought that was very helpful to, it was a really good exercise for us to really understand first what is patient experience data, what are the different types of patient experience data, and really embody what stakeholders were looking for when 21st Century Cures and PDUFA 6 and all of these conversations were happening. If you could go to the next slide, please. You'll see the language, Annie, that you were referring to. As you mentioned, it was very brief in 21st Century Cures, kind of what is the requirement for the statement of patient experience. It really just states, make public a brief statement regarding the patient experience data and related information, if any, submitted and reviewed as part of the application. In addition to the Section 3001 language, I do want to also highlight some language that was included in a subsequent section 3004 because it's very closely tied to 3001, which is that FDA at certain time points, as you'll see every 5 years, 2021 and so forth, is required to put a report assessing the use of patient experience data in regulatory decision-making, in particular with respect to the review of patient experience data and information on patient-focused drug development tools as part of applications. And so I can tell you, as we thought and decided on how to implement Section 3001, we also were paying very close attention to the language in Section 3004 to make sure that it was something that we can work towards in an efficient manner. If you could go to the next slide, please. You will see the table once again that Annie included in her slides. And so as she mentioned, this is the table that is in review documents. There are three main kind of sections to the table. You'll see the very top section, about like half, maybe 2/3 of the table perhaps, is really on patient experience data that was submitted as part of the application, and there's like different types, and there's always an other as well. And then you'll have the second primary section was patient experience data that may not have been submitted as part of the application, but was still considered in this review. And then you have the last line, which is patient experience data was not submitted as part of this application. So those are kind of the three main sections as far as the rows go. And you will see there's a column on the right, which is, on the left, it really is just a checkbox. It was more of like a process kind of view, like you indicate whether or not something was, submitted and or discussed. And then on the right, you indicate if it was discussed, where it was in the rest of the review documentation. The purpose of this table is not to capture the discussion itself, more referring to where a discussion may be in a review document. If you could go to the next slide, I do want to go back to a little bit about the guidance series that we're developing, because I do think it very much is tied to the table and so forth as well. Because what we're looking to do with the guidance is, and a lot of the other work that we're doing right now under PDUFA 6 and 21st Century Cures is really ensure the quality in the patient experience data that is collected and perhaps submitted as part of the applications and then therefore eventually in this table, right? So it does kind of go back to kind of what we're doing right now primarily, which is developing these methodological guidances to really enable stakeholders to go beyond the therapeutic context, the really powerful narrative, but also go on and collect data that can serve as study endpoints, which can be used as a basis for marketing decisions. And if you go to the next slide, you'll just see here briefly an update on where we are with all of our different guidances and associated public workshops. It's been a busy few years, and a busy few upcoming years as well, as you will see. Most recently, I'll highlight PFDD Guidance 2, which is the methods to identify what is important to patients, was the most recently issued draft guidance this past September. September, and the public docket for that is still open. So if you're not familiar with that, please feel free to review and provide us with public comments. And I'll also do a quick plug-in for our upcoming public workshop for PFDD Guidance 4, which will be on December 6th. And this will be focusing on topics related to incorporating clinical outcome assessments into endpoints for regulatory decision-making. And to quickly close, if I could have the next slide, please. I do want to leave us with kind of what we're thinking is our vision for patient-focused drug development. And all the work that we're doing is really kind of tied back to keeping this vision in mind, which is ensuring competence and reliability and accuracy of patient experience data for regulatory decision-making. And so this, once again, goes back to our guidance work that we're really doing to really ensure the quality and reliability of the data that's submitted to us. In applications. We're looking to reduce regulatory uncertainty for sponsors, and we're doing that by trying to be consistently applying our standards and communicating clearly what our expectations are and so forth. We're also looking to promote rapid, consistent adoption, so really ensuring that review staff, developers, patients, and research are all aware of everything that we're saying and being consistent about, so really through guidances and through processes and a lot of other available resources. So it's really that bi-directional communication and engagement. And at the end of the day, we're really just looking to sustain incorporation of patients' experience in drug development and decision-making. So really just make PFDD a standard practice. And I think we're on the way towards doing that. And I think that's my last slide. Or I might have one slide, I think, with just contact information. That's all I had as well. So I'll turn it back to you, Eleanor.
Well, I want to thank you both. I think that was really very informative. It really kind of brings people up to date on what's been going on with this. And so thank you both for those presentations. And if anyone has a question, please use the chat function and send your question in. But I'm going to kick it off with a question that I'd like to just start the discussion with. So for both of you, do you think this patient experience section is working as it was intended? Do we see it as rolling out in the way that the patient community intended, Annie, and from the FDA side? Meghana, could you both comment on that?
I can start. So first of all, I want to recognize that I think we're still early in the adoption phase of this. So I think that's important to note. And I do want to acknowledge that, I do know that it was a lot of work to make sure that this was implemented and that all of the review staff had this in front of them, was utilizing it consistently across divisions. So I just want to make sure that we give that appropriate recognition before we dive into what else we need to be doing. I do think, though, that there's certainly a lot of opportunity for growth as this is utilized into better understanding, how it's working. I know Sanofi just released a report that they had done an assessment of how the PED tool is being utilized, how many submissions are reflecting, certain kinds of data that's being put in. What we really wanted, first of all, was both the feedback loop, but then for there to be a recognition that patient experience data was of importance to the agency, which I think is being done in a number of ways, through the guidances, through the workshops, that's being encouraged. But I think, as I said earlier, I think one of the ways that this could be done is perhaps even in incorporating into the meetings that sponsors have with the agency some discussion of, will there be patient experience data incorporated into a submission? Earlier discussion around what kind of data may be being brought forward, and maybe that should be a part of a pre-IND or Type C meeting between a sponsor and the agency, so that it's becoming a part of the regular discussion and a part of the considerations on the part of the sponsor and the agency. I do think it's important to say that it was never intended that there would be a parallel effort being made by patient communities outside of the work that the sponsor was doing. I think our intention all along was that patient communities would be working with sponsors and that sponsors would be reaching out to the patient communities within the disease areas that they were working, so that any data that would be brought forward would be done as a part of their submission. So I think that's important. This is not intended to sort of sideline a submission. But I do think there's a lot of room for growth for how this is utilized. And that as we look at what the areas of the checklist are, that there's potentially room to even expand the boxes there in the checklist as we move forward, and perhaps into, you know, I don't know if that has to be a part of PDUFA 7 or it could be done a little more informally, but I think there's an opportunity to look at that and see whether or not those categories could be further refined, if there might be other categories of data that would be of use. And I think even talking to the reviewers, there would be an opportunity to understand from reviewers' point of view how this could be a more useful tool for them. So I think I'll stop there, but I do think there's an opportunity for growth.
Meghana?
Yeah, no, I can jump in. I can jump in. I'll definitely say, you know, we had, I believe it was 180 days to implement this requirement. So thanks, Annie, for giving us a shout out about how quickly we had to implement it. And I think yes, I think it is, you know, as I mentioned, we needed to fulfill that requirement, but while we were doing that, we also wanted to keep the latter requirement regarding the report, and we do think this table will help us fulfill that requirement, and so there is that. I would agree with Annie that it is, of course, an early adoption phase. We are certainly in early implementation phase, so I think it's important to keep that in mind. And I also think it's important to keep the broader context in mind. The patient experience data has to be submitted in an application before it could be talked about in a review, for example. Does that make sense? So it's kind of thinking about it in that context as well. And even for the products, the ecosystem broadly, this term of patient experience data and patient-focused drug development is still a little bit newer when you think about how long some of these product development programs have been in, and that they're just now coming to fruition, right, and things of that nature. So keeping that in mind as well. And as we work in our guidances and as they become completed and the FDA makes clear kind of our thinking as far as the methodological rigor that we expect to see as this data is collected and so forth, I would think that we would see an increase in the amount of patient experience data that is collected, for example, in that way. And that definitely has some downstream effects. So once again, kind of getting to the fact that this is it's early adoption phase for the table, certainly, but it's also early adoption phase for like patient experience data, I would say, and so forth as well, the science of patient input. I think one other point that you mentioned, Annie, is this idea of consistency. And so I think we can recognize that there could be more consistency, and that's broader than patient experience data. That's consistency across reviews. And I think this is a point that OND more broadly with the reorg and all of the other new policies and efforts that they've been taking underway, a public workshop they had just yesterday, for example, has been in recognition of the fact that this is something that the community has been asking for. And so they are looking, you know, for ways to ensure that there's more consistency across the portfolios.
So let me add a question about something that Annie raised, and both of you can comment on this. I've been part of conversations, as Annie said, we were part of a panel where it was brought up, you know, what kind of changes would people like to see to the form, to the format for the future, just thinking about as we move forward and as we gain more experience with this. And so one of the things that I threw out as a question was, what opportunity is there to be actually doing a lot of analysis of the data that's in the forms that have been filled out thus far, and how we might be able to use that to guide us on what we need for the future? And Meghana, I know that there's a report that's due where you are going to be analyzing some of these data that are in there in order to fulfill the requirement for that report for 2021. Could you talk a little bit about what some of that what some of the data does look like, or what kind of analyses are going on that we could use that information to figure out what the next steps are for refinement of this tool?
Sure, Eleanor. Thanks for the question. Unfortunately, I don't think I can actually comment on what that report may look like or how the evaluation is being conducted quite yet. But I will say that, the table and the review documentations are made publicly available for applications that are approved, of course. And so they are publicly available and they're out there. So if groups are interested in doing such an analysis, it's certainly feasible, but I don't think I can actually comment on any internal work related to that.
Can I just add to that? Well, I was just going to add, I think one of the challenges, though, is that it's really hard to find the PED table unless you know to look for it. And so I think as we've sort of talked to people, there are just so many people who don't even know it existed or didn't know where to find it, or it's really hard to find it and, pull it out separately. And so I think within the agency, if the agency is looking at how to make things maybe more user-friendly or even make it possible for people to do some of their own assessments, if this could even be pulled out as something that, I don't know, as a part of some people have suggested the drug trial snapshots and put in places that people could go to find it and aggregate and find this data, that would be very helpful so that it is being socialized in other places that people are going for that kind of information, instead of being sort of buried in places that people may not be able to find it as easily or access it.
Mm-hmm. So Annie, if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds like you want the table right now, it's kind of serving the purpose of kind of being a process check and kind of an orientating piece, right? But you're thinking of having it also serve as a communication tool.
Yeah.
Essentially, right?
Absolutely.
That's really helpful feedback. Thank you.
Yeah. Meghana, you brought up a really important point, and that's that the ones that are publicly available are for products that have been approved. And it might actually be that we may be able to learn more from the forms for products that have not been approved. So do you foresee that the FDA would be looking at it from that angle? And I guess my question is really, is there a way for the FDA to take a look at these data and say, wow, we're noticing that if you have the patient experience data and it's been utilized in the drug development process, it seems like there's a relationship with a positive approval as opposed to non-approval or questions being asked in some way that might delay approval. Is that an aspect that might be looked at in the future?
I think I'll take it a little bit more broadly, the question, which is kind of just, I think we all would agree that the science of patient input in general is an evolving space. And so as we certainly will internally try to kind of understand, what type of patient experience data we're seeing, what type are we potentially not seeing, so that we can kind of identify where there may be gaps, where there might be need for additional guidance or policy work or capacity building, a range of different things that could kind of come as an output. So we certainly are going to be taking a look internally, certainly, of how this information is being used and so forth. I don't know if that gets at kind of what you were getting at, Eleanor, with your question, but we do hope to kind of we do plan to do we do want to understand how we can continue to move this field forward, certainly, and the best way to do that is to understand what we're getting and what we're seeing, certainly.
Yeah, and I guess that would include what you're seeing in applications that are not approved, where that data may not be available for public scrutiny. You certainly would be able to, you meaning the FDA, would certainly be able to incorporate that into any of the broader types of analyses that you might want to do.
We certainly would be able to, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good, great. I do have a question that's come in through the chat function, and it was that, the guidance documents that are being worked on now, especially 2 and 3 that are specifically geared towards COA, those are going to replace the 2009 patient-reported outcome guidance. So one of the questions is that still the thinking? Will that still move forward, or will the 2009 PRO guidance remain in place?
So I think I'll just make one clarification, which I think it's actually 3 and 4, Eleanor, because I think 1, which really gets at sampling and representativeness, and 2, which gets at, you know, the mixed methods, qualitative and quantitative methods are pretty broadly applicable, certainly, but 3 and 4, I think, is really when you're getting into the COA-specific territory, the clinical outcome assessment-specific territory. And I would say yes, the answer to your question, that is kind of still the vision, but we do have a public workshop coming up for guidance for on December 6th, as I mentioned, and so that's an opportunity for us to have public feedback and so forth in a public workshop setting, and then as the draft guidances become eventually available, there will be, of course, opportunity for the public to comment then as well to see how all the pieces fit. I think one of the main distinctions, I would say, the 2009 guidance that you're referring to is PRO-specific, patient-reported outcomes, whereas, as you know, based on the discussion document from the Guidance 3 workshop, the Guidance 3 is a little bit broader. It's other types of clinical outcome assessments as well, and not just patient-reported outcomes specific.
Right. That plan is still in place. Great. Thank you. I have another question that's come in through the chat function, and it is, how are the patient experience data initiatives at FDA being integrated in with the diversity initiative to help ensure the representativeness of the experience of the patients in patient experience data?
I'm not exactly sure if I understand the question, to be quite honest, Eleanor.
I guess the question is there any type of intentional integration between the patient experience data work that's going on and the diversity initiative, just to help ensure that when we're doing patient experience work and gathering patient experience data, we are considering diversity?
I would say certainly. I mean, I think this is what Guidance 1 is getting to completely, right? It's who do you collect the information from, and it really encourages making sure that you're trying to get a representative sample and that you're using mixed methodology so that you can get to hard-to-reach populations or vulnerable populations or the different types of subpopulations, whatever that may be. So I would say yes, certainly.
But perhaps it doesn't sound like there's an intentional integration of different initiatives. It's just the intended overlap.
I guess I'll just take it a step further. I'm still not sure if I'm understanding the question, I guess, but it's also important to remember at the end of the day that the agency isn't collecting the patient experience data. You know, at the end of the day, we're providing guidance related to our thinking on how it should be collected so that it's fit for purpose, particularly for regulatory decision making, and we're encouraging stakeholders to collect it from, you know, representative populations and all of that. But at the end of the day, we're not collecting the patient experience data. It's on sponsors to include it in their application, whether they're collecting it or others are collecting it. Is a different question.
Yeah. I think the question is really getting to there are initiatives to, for example, increase diversity within clinical trials. And so I guess the question, the way I'm understanding it or the way that I'm reading it is, are any of those initiatives that get to, for example, increasing diversity within clinical trials, are any of those overlapping at all or integrated at all with what's going on with patient experience initiatives, just simply because there would be alignment there in that you would want to increase diversity in your data collection?
Certainly. I think we certainly encourage that, and we do work closely with most of the clinical trial diversity. I think a lot of that happens in the Center for Drugs through the Office of Medical Policy, for example, and so forth. And so we do work closely with all of our colleagues. And we have been, you know, really encouraging stakeholders to incorporate patient perspectives as they're planning and designing clinical trials and so forth, you know. And so there's a lot of overlap there as well. So I would say yes.
Great. Another question from the chat function, and that is, with patient experience data should include information that comes from family and family caregivers. So what is your take on data from the public? So for instance, stigma and discrimination by the public towards individuals with certain diseases, such as infectious diseases, cancers, skin diseases. What is your view on data that might come from public sources like that? I guess, Meghana, from your perspective, how the FDA is treating those kinds of data. And Annie, I think from the patient community perspective, how that data would be collected or utilized or provided in being able to provide a comprehensive view of patient experience?
Yeah. I guess as I'm listening to the question, I'm reflecting on, I'm a part of an effort that actually National Health Council has helped to convene with the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy. You can help me with the acronym, Eleanor, but it's the PAVE initiative, the Patient Values and Healthcare Initiative. Am I getting the acronym? Patient-driven values in healthcare.
I actually don't know that I can help you, but I should be able
to. It's a PAVE initiative. But anyway, the initiative is an effort to develop values that reflect patient values that are currently not incorporated into valuations, metrics of valuations. And it's in a really interesting, and I serve on the steering group for this, and it's a really interesting group of individuals because I am one of the only individuals in the effort that represents a rare disease patient community. Many of the other individuals in this group represent different patient communities, either by ethnic diversity, cultural diversities. So there are a lot of different lenses through which we've been looking at the values and the metrics that are currently collected. And the discussions that we've had have been really interesting around how do current political climates impact patient communities' abilities to access health care or the decisions that people may make. So if you're a patient community whose health care may disappear depending on an election, how would that impact the decisions that you would make or your vulnerabilities? If you are a particular minority group, if you have a specific infectious disease. So it's been actually a very important, I think, conversation to look at what other kinds of values and domains we should be collecting in the data that we currently collect. And then the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy is now going out and validating those domains so that they could perhaps be integrated into existing value assessment frameworks. So as I'm listening to so that's all just in background, but as I'm listening to the question, my reaction to the question would be that it would seem to me that it would be incumbent on, I would think that it would be incumbent on a patient community or a sponsor that was working in that space to be integrating those considerations into the data that we're collecting and to be bringing that forward. And I do think that question is incredibly important and would hope that that's a part of the types of patient preference work that patient communities in those spaces are doing. So just as an example, in Duchenne, which is not an infectious disease and not a disease that necessarily applies to the question, we've been, in the Duchenne community, we've been doing a lot of patient preference work that started with caregivers, but then expanded to look at patient preferences and differences that may exist between the caregivers and the individuals living with Duchenne themselves, and then expanded that work to layer it to see whether there were preferential differences between the caregivers, individuals with Duchenne, and their providers, and to expand that work so that the preference work we were doing was sort of looking at the differences between those groups. And in the same way, I would think that patient communities that are perhaps in infectious diseases or in other communities like you described would be also layering their considerations in the communities that they were looking at so that you could look at how the ability to make decisions within healthcare would be impacted by either social stigma, cultural stigmas, et cetera, and then bringing that forward into the submissions so that, again, they could be a part of the contextual considerations that reviewers are making. So that's not the agency, that's just from a patient community perspective, I think there's a really rich opportunity to be collecting that data and doing it in such a way that it's thoughtful, that it's reflective of that particular patient community's experience, and that and to be sitting with the regulatory authorities and working with them to make sure that the attributes that are being collected are done in such a way that they will be impactful to the regulatory process.
Thanks, Annie. And I actually took the liberty of looking up what PAVE stands for, and it's Patient-Driven Values in Healthcare Evaluation. And that's a project at the University of Maryland. So thanks for that. I think that was very helpful. Meghana, did you want to add anything to that?
I'll just add, I think I do want to remind folks that in the table as it is currently, there is a section about kind of patient experience data that may have not been submitted as part of the application but was considered in the review. So there is kind of that opportunity for, inclusion of patient experience data, such as a PFDD meeting that a reviewer may have attended or read the report of, or, we have rare disease listening sessions. So there are some opportunities, but at the same time, I think keeping in mind that, our reviewers can't take it upon themselves to find every type of patient experience data and do it and incorporate it and so forth as well. So it's kind of, as Annie was saying, there's a real rich opportunity for external stakeholders, but from our perspective, it's really important to remember that our reviewers are really focusing on what's submitted as part of an application. And it's, I don't think I need to go into our staffing and our recruiting and our hiring issues that we have on this webinar, but keeping kind of that frame of mind as far as managing expectations, as far as what our reviewers can and cannot do is also important.
Thanks. So I'm going to go with one last question here, and it really gets to benefit risk assessment. Can you give us some thoughts, both of you, on the how the statement of patient experience and report on patient experience should be having an effect on benefit risk assessment?
Yes. And I love that this question came in, and I promise I didn't submit it for the chat box, but I pretty much could have. And actually, if you go back,
Annie, I'll confess it was my question.
Oh, okay. It could have been mine. Actually, if you go back, I think it was slide 20 that has the image of the benefit risk framework. There was actually another piece of legislation that we helped lead and introduce that passed in the Senate. It did not pass in the House, so it was not signed into law, but it was right after PFIA, and it was actually called BENEFIT, was the acronym. And it was the Better Empowerment Now to Enhance Frameworks and Improve Treatments. I can remember that one. I can't remember PAVE. But the idea behind it was to actually ensure that PFDD data was formally integrated into the benefit risk framework itself. And we're not trying to be overly prescriptive. We weren't saying that this grid had to be, the 3x5 grid had to be expanded to another column or another row. But what we did want was there to be an actual formal integration of PFDD within this framework, because we thought there needed to be an enhancement of the transparency and accountability within the framework itself, and to understand how PFDD was going to be considered at the point of decision making within the BR framework. So we still feel that there's a lot of that there's an opportunity here, and we hear it come up time and time again, and that has not yet happened. And while it's implicit, it's not explicit. So I think I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you, Annie. Meghana?
Thanks, Eleanor, and thanks, Silke, for bringing me back to this slide. So I think this conveys that we certainly see an opportunity, and I think there's examples as well. I don't think it's novel by any means to incorporate what matters most to patients when conducting a benefit risk assessment. Certainly, the PFDD meetings and the reports and the qualitative narrative that we see already really does give us insight into that therapeutic context, a better understanding of what matters most to patients, where is there potentially an unmet need, for example, what would be meaningful outcomes and so forth. And then as we start moving forward and really collecting robust, methodologically sound fit-for-purpose data that can serve as study endpoints, it can be more direct source of evidence, certainly, using, for example, clinical outcome measures and so forth, as you'll see. So we certainly see a place for it in the benefit-risk assessment of our reviews. And we already do it, in my opinion.
Great. Well, I want to thank you both for your time and for doing this webinar for us. We really appreciate it. And I think, Silke, if you'll go down to our last slide, we're going to be taking a break from our webinar series in December. We know that we've got a lot of events and activities going on between now and the end of the year. We know other organizations do too, and that a number of people will be taking some time off during the holidays. So we are going to skip December, and we will be announcing our next clinical outcome assessment webinar in January of 2020. We want to thank our speakers for today, and we want to also thank all of you for joining in. So stay tuned, watch your email, and there will be an announcement for January coming out sometime in the next few weeks. Thank you all and have a great weekend.